Today, we're diving into one of the most foundational legal texts in early Islam. It's the fourth chapter of the Quran called An-Nisa, which literally means the women. And it's so fascinating because it's not just a spiritual guide, it's also a radical blueprint for social reform. So let's get into it. And the big question we're asking throughout this explainer is this: how on earth did a text from the 7th century end up creating this incredibly detailed legal safety net for the people who needed it most? We're talking specifically about women and orphans. The answer tells us so much about how a new society was being built. So, here's our game plan. First, we'll get to know the chapter itself. Then, we'll step back in time to understand the crisis that was happening when it was revealed. After that, we'll see the new social blueprint it laid out, get into the nitty-gritty of the protections it offered, and finally, we'll look at how people read and debate these verses today. All right, first things first. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is Surah An-Nisa? Well, the name An-Nisa tells you a lot. It means the women. And as you can probably guess, it gets deep into issues about women, family, inheritance, and social justice. But the really crucial piece of information here is that it's a Medinan surah. That means it was revealed after the early Muslims had moved to Medina and were in the messy, complicated process of actually building a new community with new rules. And that historical context is everything. These verses didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were a direct, on-the-ground response to a massive crisis that the community in Medina was facing. If you look at the timeline, it all clicks into place. The Muslims migrate to Medina, and pretty soon they're in a number of conflicts. The Battle of Uhud was a huge one, a real turning point. It's right after this battle that the verses of An-Nisa started to be revealed over a period of several years to deal with the aftermath. So what was this crisis? Well, the battle was devastating. A lot of Muslim men were killed, and suddenly the community was left with a huge number of widows and orphans who had lost their husbands, their fathers, their providers. The old tribal systems just couldn't cope, and these women and children were incredibly vulnerable. And that vulnerability, well, it was often exploited. For instance, there was this pre-Islamic practice where a male guardian could marry an orphan girl under his care. But it wasn't about protecting her. It was a loophole to legally absorb her inheritance and property. It was exactly this kind of injustice that An-Nisa was sent to put a stop to. So what was the solution? The surah didn't just offer words of comfort. It laid down a whole new legal and social blueprint, one designed to completely rewire the society to protect its most vulnerable members. And this is where you see the Quran acting as this dynamic, living legal document. An-Nisa wasn't just suggesting a better way. It was laying down the law, actively shaping a new moral society and drawing clear lines about what was and was not acceptable behavior. Just look at this comparison. The shift was radical. Before, women and orphans were often totally cut out of inheritance. A woman's dowry, that was handled by her male relatives. An-Nisa comes along and just flips the script. For the first time, it sets out specific, legally required inheritance shares for women, and it gives women total control over their own property. This wasn't just social reform, this was an economic revolution. Okay, so let's dig into the actual laws. How did this new protective framework really work in practice? This verse, I think, just perfectly captures the spirit of the whole chapter. It's basically saying that fighting for justice isn't just a nice thing to do, it's a sacred duty. It directly links faith with the active, real-world struggle to protect the oppressed. So this new safety net was very concrete. You had clear, almost mathematical laws about who inherits what. You had new rules for marriage. Polygyny was permitted, sure, but it came with this huge condition. You had to treat all wives justly. It was a direct response to the widow crisis, but with a major ethical check. The surah explicitly made it illegal to cheat orphans out of their property, and it even laid out who you couldn't marry to prevent incest. It's incredibly detailed. Of course, whenever you're dealing with a 7th century legal text, the big question is, what does this mean for us today? And this is where the conversation gets really dynamic, because scholars are still debating and interpreting these verses. The scholar Amina Wadud offers a really helpful way to think about this. She suggests there are basically 3 ways to read the Quran: a traditional way, which might reinforce older social structures, a reactive way, which can be a bit defensive, and a holistic way. And that holistic approach is key because it tries to understand the text's core values, like justice, within its original time and place, which opens the door to a modern feminist reading.
Now, this verse right here, 434, is probably one of the most famous and most debated verses in the whole Quran. It says men are the protectors and maintainers of women. But what does that really mean? How you answer that question changes everything.
So you've got these two main camps. A traditional view often takes this verse to mean that men have a kind of authority or leadership role in the family. But then you have the holistic or feminist reading, which says, hang on, let's look at the context. In 7th century Arabia, men were the sole breadwinners. So this perspective argues the verse is describing a practical economic role, financial maintenance, not decreeing some kind of permanent inherent male superiority. And the point here isn't to declare a winner. It's to show that engaging with these texts is a living, breathing process. The conversation is not over. The meaning isn't frozen in time. It's constantly being discussed, debated, and re-examined. All right, so let's wrap this up. What are the big takeaways? Number 1, An-Nisa was a real-time, practical solution to a massive social crisis. 2, it created legal rights for women and orphans that were absolutely revolutionary for that time and place. And 3, the conversation is still going. These verses are at the heart of rich debates from traditional to feminist interpretations, which shows just how relevant they still are. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. How much does understanding why a text was written, the specific problems it was trying to solve back then, change how we read it and apply it today? It's a huge question, and it's central to how we relate to any ancient foundational text from our past.